All right. Hello, everyone out there. I'm Father Alan Boyd at St. Sophia Cathedral with our young adult forum group. It's a Orthodox Young Professionals group, and we're here this week with my favorite professor at Holy Cross Seminary, Dr. Timothy Patitsas. Really, you are my favorite professor from there. I have very fond memories of your classes and even many of the discussions that took place outside of class and some of the projects that we worked on while we were there. Before we get started, I'd like to start with a prayer. If we could have everyone stand, please.
Okay, let's see if I can stand with these headphones. Yeah.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, you who are everywhere present and filling all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us of every stain, and save our souls, O good one. So, Dr. Tim,
Amen. Yeah.
We've heard a lot in the news over the last few years about the number of suicides taking place among military returning from Afghanistan, and the rate of suicides actually outnumbers quite a bit the number of deaths in battle. And it's something quite disturbing to hear about, and you know, we wonder, is there any kind of answer to that? Is there any way to deal with that? Because it doesn't seem like it's been dealt with in healthy ways. And we want to know, what is the Orthodox response to all of this? And we've had a chance to kind of read your article, which is brilliant. Which is I love being able to read it, and I just thought you might be able to lead the group in a discussion about that particular issue and about the harm that comes to soldiers in war and what we might do to be able to heal that.
Yeah, it's a tough issue, and it's a tough issue, and trauma isn't just something that soldiers experience, but a lot of people have traumatic experiences that they have difficulty recovering from. And really, my article isn't the last word on anything. It's just was my attempt as an ethicist to say something, about something that important, to say something small that that would be more or less, broadly speaking, within the ethos of the Church, within the historical experience of the Church. And of course, this isn't a class, it wasn't homework to read the article, so I will tell you what's in it, of course. But it starts with this basic notion that in Orthodox cultures, it was assumed that that no matter how justified a war was, that participating in it or witnessing it would impact your soul. So there was the presumption that a person could be spiritually impacted. Now, some soldiers have read this article some veterans, and they've emphasized that it isn't every soldier that experiences a post-traumatic stress reaction or has a persistence of traumatic reaction in the same way. And then many soldiers too have emphasized that the experience of combat can refine the soul in some ways and refine the character. So there's that side of it too. It isn't that everyone is affected in the same way. But other soldiers have written me and said that they thought that article was said it about as well as could be said. That that the impact is a given, and there's always going to be some kind of impact about living out that experience of combat.
You contrasted in the article the difference between an Orthodox Byzantine mindset and the Western mindset of just war. Maybe you might stop for a minute and explain the difference of what that is. What does the Western Church mean when they talk about just war theory, and how might what we believe differ from that?
Well, I just it isn't that our church doesn't use elements of just war theory. We do, to try to decide which wars we ought to get involved in as a society. It's just that even the most justified war from an Orthodox perspective is still can harm the soul of the participants, and that's the emphasis that we probably add. So I don't want to be too critical of the West, because that's sort of just what we do for a living as Orthodox. You know, but the thing is that the Church has this older tradition that no matter how necessary killing is, it still does impact the soul, and so the Church put limits on communication, on communion or excommunication after combat. But I think that is true, that to some extent, even today, among like commentators in the news, you know, our great wise men and women who talk about these things on the television and stuff, that they do presume that as long as the other guy had it coming, that it shouldn't bother you so much to let him have it. And that's an extremely wrong and naive view from the standpoint of the Church. The Church preserves the pacifist option, but it doesn't require that entire societies be pacifist. But nevertheless, we're not under some illusion that the whole thing is a grand and glorious crusade and everyone's unmarred afterwards. In fact, the reverse. It's presumed that you're somehow going to be impacted spiritually.
So in war, it seems necessary at times, for the sake of lives. What gets emphasized is sort of the dehumanization of the enemy. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, that's the effect that, you know. I mean, in a sense, it is killing someone is literally dehumanizing, no matter what attitude you do it with, because you're separating the soul from the body and you're returning them to this. You're making them an object. And
exactly. But doesn't the training take place ahead of time to train men to do that, to see them as something other than human, what you're shooting at ahead of time, so that you don't hesitate for the sake of the lives of your brothers that are around you?
I think the training can go sort of two ways. I mean, on the one hand, we've tried to move from training to conditioning, so that there's more of an automatic habitual response, the so-called double tap, or the fact that you're definitely that in training you'll use targets that are more lifelike and realistic. So you want to condition is the thinking. But then of course there's another side of training that can actually sort of verbalize that the enemy is somehow subhuman. Of course, that can happen that can happen spontaneously among soldiers without any encouragement from officers or drill instructors. But I think that is more dangerous, that culture of verbalizing that the enemy is somehow less than human, because for one thing, it makes you defenseless, because actually people are really smart everywhere, and there are all kinds of good soldiers all over the place, and you never know what you're going to run into. It's better to probably to think. It's better to think of your enemy as, you know, a complex and problem-solving person, and it has a spiritual effect because when someone you despise hurts you, it stings a lot more. I mean, that's an understatement. It's a lot more of an impact on the soul. It's better to go in a loving way, in a sense, and think of your enemy as, hey, they think they're doing, as Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural, that, you know, we each do the right as God gives us to see the right, and we have to accept that to some extent neither side will have a perfect monopoly on the right. Even if one side is preponderantly correct, neither side is going to be completely blameless. That kind of attitude helps inoculate the soul against what they face in combat. Do you want to ask a question to get me back on track, so far?
Yeah. Noah is going to...
Hey, Dr. Patitsas, it's Noah. So the title of the article that you wrote here for Road to Emmaus is The Opposite of War is Not Peace. And I think it's a really engaging title, and the subtitle being Healing Trauma in the Iliad and the Orthodox Tradition. That second part is maybe a lot deeper to jump into first, but could you please just give us a brief overview of the article, especially given the title, going more into what you mean by the opposite of war is not peace?
Yeah, I think what we look at in the article is how combat is very similar to liturgy, in that we say about liturgy that it engages all five senses, and we say that liturgy impacts the whole soul, mind, and body, the total unity of a person, and combat does that too. It impacts all the senses. It influences your whole person. Now, among brother soldiers, actual combat can be like liturgy too, in that it can increase the communion among, what's the word, friends and allies and the people that you're fighting alongside of. But its purpose towards the enemy is the reverse. It's to excommunicate them and to drive them from life. And so, because the fathers of the church think of war as really the greatest evil, it's not premarital sex, right? Like somehow in American culture, somehow we get the idea that that's a greater evil. But war really is the ultimate evil. We know even now, I mean, over the past 100 or 200 years, the percentage of non-combatants that are killed in a war it's pretty stable. It's about 50%. Even with precision weapons, about half the people killed in combat are non-combatants. And I'm not making light of the sexual morality of the church. I'm just saying that war is in the church's eyes a great evil and something to be avoided through spying and clever intelligence and diplomacy and bribes and pretty much whatever it takes. Deterrence, the Byzantines did all that. But your question is, how is the opposite of war not peace? Well, the opposite of war really is liturgy, but Christ's liturgy, which takes all the violence of the world into the self and turns it into life.
Wow, that's a big statement and a lot to unpack there. But stepping it back, you mentioned that war is the biggest evil for the fathers, and I think that statement alone is just really maybe hard to even chew for most Americans. I think a lot of us here are millennials. We grew up our childhood with the first war in Iraq with the first Bush. My first day of 8th grade, it was the 9/11 attacks, and ever since then we've been at war in Afghanistan, at Yemen, at Libya, all over the world. Constantly, my whole life has been friends and family and it at war. Um, and I think you're right that in America we often soften what that means, and we're like, oh, it's a just war, it's good, and if you're killing people, you're protecting your country, and those things are true or not true, but uh, you're saying that in the Orthodox world, this is an evil. Like, could you help people? How would you help to rationalize that for an American who's not Orthodox?
I suppose, I mean, maybe apostasy is a worse evil, and to deny Christ is worse than being killed, for example, by an enemy. But on the other hand, it's so easy. It just once a war starts, you just don't know what's going to happen, and chains of events unfold, and you wind up often denying Christ in other ways, and in practical ways, by killing the least of these and things like that, and sometimes the alternative may be worse, right? The alternative to the war may be some worse thing. When the fathers say it as the worst evil, they don't mean that at all costs necessarily we should avoid it, but they mean that it's the biggest evil in the sense that once it happens, anything can happen. I remember in the first Gulf War, America was in a terrible savings and loan crisis, and we had the bulk of our army there in Saudi Arabia, and I just thought, well, gee, if that guy has a few atomic weapons, I mean, this could really be could break us in a way if we lose our army over there, and you just don't know what's going to happen once the fighting starts, and we have to keep that in mind and try to do whatever we can to make peace. I'm not saying that the soldier isn't noble once the order is given and it has to happen. Yeah, but even then, he's going to be harmed, and chances are, many times, without willing it, he'll become involved in collateral damage, as we say. That is really terrible. I mean, imagine if that happened to your children or your brothers and sisters, that they were killed in this collateral damage kind of scenario. It really is a great evil.
In your article, you describe the kind of the perfect blend. I'll just quote here: Christian Rome, Byzantium, was a perfect blend and balance of three modes of being in this world. They had the mind of the classical Hellenistic Greeks. They had the heart and personalism of the Semitic world, of the Jews in particular, and they had the practical rationality and organization of the Romans. Like this three-part holistic idea of a person. Could you kind of go in further and relate that to
unpack it a little bit?
That? I mean, I thought that was really interesting, and especially in contrast to the American mind over the Byzantine mind.
I think America is a lot like Rome in our kind of outlook on the world, and probably we to an extent we think about war the way pre-Christian Rome did, but the Romans had a couple of things really going for them, and that we can relate to too. One is they were always willing to adopt to an extent what they found in the peoples that they assimilated and conquered, and in particular with the Greeks, they looked up to Greek culture, much like in today throughout much of Asia, a lot of people still venerate Chinese culture, or maybe 100 years ago, Americans looked up to French language and culture or something, but. So the Romans looked to the Greeks, although they mistrusted them too. They recognized them for what they did well in terms of philosophy and letters and art and architecture, and they took that on. The Romans were better engineers, of course, and they were better military guys. But in any case, my point is, after St. Constantine, it doesn't cease being Roman. The identity remains Roman in Istanbul and in Christian Constantinople to this day, and the Greek is something that they adopt because it's excellent. But the identity is Roman, and then of course the faith is Christian, and it's Semitic because of its holism, its way of the heart, and all that. So they really did have a sense that as Romans they should be the best, and as Romans that they were qualified to join all the other things into the best.
Yeah.
They weren't that humble, but to some extent they succeeded in this, right? So sometimes we get nervous because in the hymns of the church they'll say things about the Jews this, the Jews that, and I see recently they're trying to translate that Judeans just to soften that. But you just have to know where to look in the hymns, because in the hymns also they have a lot of things to say humiliating about the Greeks. So they were the Romans, and they thought that they also understood that it was Roman soldiers that had crucified Christ. So there was some humility about all these cultures when they tried to fuse them.
So
yeah.
You go on and say that with the West lost or minimized with time was a particular emphasis on the way of the heart, which I think you refer to the Semitic Jewish tradition of personhood, of the way of the heart. Could you go in further and relate how this way of the heart should form how we approach the issue of war, just war, pacifism, as Orthodox Christians?
Yeah, I think in the specifically how the way of heart relates to the just war versus the Orthodox view of war is just that spiritually we can see that no matter how intellectually justified a war is, no matter how we can rationalize the need to do it, spiritually we see that it impacts the soul, it impacts the heart of the participants. And sometimes we can see that it impacts the nation itself, that we cross lines that we shouldn't have crossed. I think for me, and I know some people would disagree with this, but for me, a line that was crossed was to drop an atomic bomb on essentially civilians in 2 cities in Japan. I think that doesn't just affect the guys who dropped it, but then that recurs to the nation, right? So it takes some kind of a repentance and a spiritual getting over to recover from that. Now, how did the West lose the way of the heart? Well, there's different thoughts about this, but you may have heard of a saint named Saint Simeon the New Theologian, and he was in the 11th century, the 1000s, and he was an Orthodox saint who attacked, or his competitors were those who thought that theology should really be done in the university, so become the way of the mind and not the way of the heart. It's sometimes said that in the West there were similar conflicts, but the university-type people gained the upper hand, and theology did become something more abstract. You can't take those kind of statements too far, because there's always saints in the West who attempt to follow the way of the heart. But on the other hand, and I mentioned this, I think in this article, or there's a sequel to this article too, already in like the 400s, there's a difference east and west within monastics themselves about which the greater sin, intellectual sins like pride or sensual sins, and the East chose the sensual sins. That was the way of the heart, and the West chose the intellectual sins, and they moved more in that other direction. Do you have a follow-up question to help me clarify?
I do.
I don't think I'm being very clear, but whatever.
No, it's great.
Sorry, people.
I was actually going to just maybe bring it together with, you refer to St. Basil the Great, who, as his pastoral care for soldiers, recommends taking 3 years abstinence from communion for soldiers who have killed in battle. I think that might help people understand like the difference between an Eastern and Western approach to the brokenness that's caused by sin over and against like a a legalistic framework. Could you help kind of maybe?
That's a good point, because in the Western tradition, since the war is justified, no sin is involved. Let me give you just an example from everyday life. If for some reason, I don't know, someone just pulled their car in front of you when you were driving and there was an accident and they died, you would not, the Orthodox Church would not think that you had any kind of guilt, right? You were innocent, but you still might address the fact that you caused the death of another person. Of course, it was their decision, but you know what I'm saying, that you were involved in this in confession. So even the things that we accidentally get involved in, the harm that we really wasn't even just having witnessed certain things, we take to confession for healing. So the sense of what sin is much more just anything that kind of disturbs the soul, knocks it off track, or just involves it in this fallen world. That's what we want to be healed from. So it's nice to be justified, but that only goes so far, right? Being right only doesn't really get you that far in actual relationships.
So in the West, there really isn't, or not much of a sense of this kind of the effects of sin as being
the brokenness. Instead, it's looked at in a very legalistic way.
Well, that the only kind of sin is guilt, involves guilt.
Yeah.
And culpability.
Right. I mean, in the West, a priest could kill and then celebrate the liturgy the same day, whereas in the East, any man who's killed, even accidentally, cannot be ordained. This is a pretty strict impediment to ordination, and of course, I suppose a bishop, in some rare circumstance, could waive that, but in general, it's thought to be pretty much absolute. So, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't. Right, you might have to kill at some experience in your life to protect your family. I don't know what that would look like, but then the priest would lose his priesthood after that. He wouldn't necessarily be laicized, but he wouldn't celebrate the liturgy anymore. He might become like a hospital chaplain or something like that, but he wouldn't celebrate the liturgy after having killed. So that's a clear sign that we take it very seriously. It always involves you in evil.
So, Dr. Tim, we have someone here that wants to ask a question.
Okay.
So I think with my generation, there's to some degree an influence on this new libertarian framework, whether it be political or social. And so I was watching recently some documentaries on war and just kind of processing it. I was wondering what the risk or the I don't know how to put it, what danger or risk is there in having a viewpoint in terms of with war, where you have this idea that there are groups of people that are basically, in a very understandable way, they're saying, look, I want to give my life and risk it for this cause. And I know ideally in a war that they would only involve those people and not, as you said before, 50% being civilians. But what do you think the risk is in saying, well, there is some understanding of that, and that's sort of the justifiable point of war, is that there's people that are just willing to give their lives for a cause. They know what they're getting into. They're fighting it out, and they're just, representing what they believe in and that kind of stuff. That makes sense. What risk is there in finding comfort in that, or finding like just in war in that? Would you say?
Well, it certainly is heroic, and it certainly is. It certainly is an admirable thing. I want to say two things about it. One is the great advance in the study of war in the 20th century. I don't mean tactics or something. I mean the actual spiritual phenomenon came at the end of World War II through this this U.S. Army historian, Slam Marshall. And I guess, well, to say in brief, what he did was he was a combat veteran from the First War, from World War I, and in World War II he was considerably older, and he headed up a team of historians, and they did extensive after-action interviews with U.S. infantry in both Pacific and Europe. And what they found was that about 85%, so that number is correct, 85% of American frontline soldiers in World War II would not fire their individual weapons in combat. Their M1 rifles or whatever, I don't know what people carried in those days. And they found that it wasn't that they would flee the battlefield, that 85%, but they would do other things. They would tend to the wounded, bring more ammunition, carry messages, all kinds of things. But essentially what Slam Marshall discovered is that most people will not kill in combat, even frontline infantry. And after his discoveries were published, the Army changed its training. And if you know anything about the history of the M16 rifle, they also thought, well, with a better rifle, maybe that will change the issue. So a better, a more effective machine gun. But since then, military historians have studied every battle for which we have data, and the numbers pretty much hold that traditionally most soldiers are not firing to kill, even on the front line, even to save their own life or the life of someone else in combat. So there's a guy named Terry Grossman. He's a U.S. Army Ranger. He's older now. He's a PhD psychologist, and he's done a lot of research on this and really worked with other people. But he's teaching police departments all the time because the natural human resistance to killing is so high that to say, it's one thing to say that I would defend my family or someone else's family, but a lot of people just can't pull that trigger, and
it does not align with the idea that the majority of these armies and whatever are going heroically to fight and to give their life. It's really a different matter once they're faced with it, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So if you try to force yourself to do it, and it's not, and you're not in that 15%. I don't know if that's harder spiritually or not, but of course, we have stories. We try to turn those people into cowards, but they won't kill. And Grossman addresses this because he is an Army officer. He says, when I read these numbers, 85% won't kill. He said, as a soldier, I feel ashamed. As a man, I feel proud. And I don't really know for these wars now what those numbers look like. I know that we claim that by Vietnam 90% of soldiers would fire, but I also know anecdotal evidence because I read a lot of like platoon level accounts, actual accounts of war in Vietnam, and a guy can spend a year in Vietnam in heavy jungle fighting and not have one confirmed kill because it takes place at distance and in the thick jungle. So I don't know how that's different in Iraq in a desert or an urban environment, and I don't know if that's impacting people. But it's hard to get real numbers because the Army will tell you it's 90% in Vietnam, that it was 50% in Korea, 90% in Vietnam, and I think that's just wrong. When you really read about like a Vietnam era sniper, they feel, a lot of them, not all of them, but some of them feel like criminals because they're the only guys with confirmed kills. Now it's different psychologically if you're doing it through artillery or doing whatever. I haven't seen American Sniper yet, by the way, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. But
Thank you.
it's everyone's different. Everyone's different, but we think for most of human history, about 85% of frontline soldiers will not kill, even to save their own life.
So most of us here, hopefully, will never fight in battle, or have not yet, though there are members of our group who have or are
one of our members
enlisted,
is currently overseas right now.
currently overseas.
Yeah.
But most of us have the ability, the responsibility, some might argue, to vote and be politically engaged. Does how does what you discuss here relate to the Orthodox Christian politically? Do we have culpability when it comes to electing officials, congressmen, and presidents who ultimately have the decision to send soldiers into war, especially given that America hasn't fought, arguably, has not fought a defensive war, as the just war theory discusses it, and I don't know when.
I think, you know, that voting is very complex because you just don't know what you're voting for, and you just don't know. I think the way that a society like Byzantium handled the issue was with the promotion of a particular culture, right? So it's important to vote, and I think vote prayerfully. But beyond that, I don't give you any advice about whom to vote for. But I think a bigger issue is that we each need to become more sophisticated in our thinking, in our spiritual life, and in our prayer, in our diplomacy, just to create that culture. And that culture really bubbles up and becomes sophisticated. Incidentally, the Byzantines, after Constantine's conversion, they did not change anything from the old Roman methods. And then they faced Attila the Hun 100 years later in the 400s, and he destroyed them completely. He completely outmatched Roman tactics and weapons. And after that, the society rethought what it would mean to survive, and how the more gung-ho Roman attitude had to be adjusted, and they had to start emphasizing other things like diplomacy and intelligence. The Byzantines became great intelligence. They collected information about every people and their anthropological habits, everything, trying to get some edge in diplomacy so they could avoid war. So I don't think it's. I mean, we have a kind of magic bullet approach. We're going to go into that voting booth and just pull the trigger, and now we're going to have what? We're just going to have another guy who just came from our culture, just like we did, and is going to stumble around blindly. And they're going to face problems, and they're going to have people in Washington D.C. pushing them in all kinds of directions, and they just need our prayers, and that's, I think prayer is really decisive. I'm not saying we shouldn't vote, you know. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, and I think my question too, I'm not trying to say that voting is the end all, but I think that oftentimes we, I won't say we, but many Christians in America have a very pro-war attitude, and they encourage this in their churches and in their speech and how they relate to each other. And I was thinking more in terms of like just political action in general. But we have another question here from.
Hi, Professor. So to the point that you just talked about the way the Byzantines dealt with war. Like they kind of like they used different tactics, and they tried to defer like the possibility of like a physical conflict as much as possible. Doesn't it seem like what's going on today in the world with like the way that the media tries to shape things in a way? Wouldn't you say that's very Byzantine in a way? Like that in that way they try to kind of pacify our minds and not reach a particular truth, so that we actually don't have like a clear way of understanding what's going on in the world. And also C.S. Lewis said once, he talked about like if there were two people that were at odds with each other, and it would be better for them to have a duel and kind of end it, end the animosity rather than carry on this lifelong enmity between the two. So I was just wondering if there's any of the fathers like have anything to say about that perspective, or if that perspective
leads to just war, or yeah.
Well, yeah, your first question is more troubling, and I don't know how to answer it. The second one, I think, is what the Christian Romans concluded was that nature abhors a vacuum. If you defeated one enemy, another one would arise, and that you might want that earlier enemy around as an ally now. So you should always, like Christ says about when you're on the way to the court, you think you're going to lose the case, so try to make a settlement before you get there. Try to make a deal, and I think this is a good perspective to think, not that we're going to just annihilate, get it over with, but of course, once you go to war, it's another thing. There are opportunities within war to allow the enemy to surrender or save face and escape, and that's sometimes that can be the right thing. I mean, what happened to the Byzantines? I mean, just to be historical about it, was that for 1,000 years, I mean, from the time of the Battle of Marathon and the ancient Greeks, the Persians were a constant menace to Greece and then Rome. And in the 600s, the Akathist hymn and all that, they finally defeated the Persians utterly. And into that vacuum came a force that was much more overwhelming than the Persians had ever been, and that was Islam and the Arabs. And so I think C.S. Lewis has a point, but I think the better way is always try to win your enemies, see what we have in common, see what we can work out. Now, the media seems to me just crazy. Like, it's just like, well, if no one believed anything, we wouldn't have war, or something seems to be their standpoint. And I think that just creates a vacuum on its own. That's like annihilating our own beliefs in freedom or democracy or free enterprise or whatever our thing is, Christianity, and saying, okay, we're not going to have those beliefs anymore. Well, that vacuum is not going to last for long. Something's going to fill it. And I don't know that it will be Islam, but it could be. It could be something else. And it's better to inculcate, at least in our own lives, is that we control in our families and our churches, what we think of as positive values, what I think of as positive values in Christ, and the importance of loving our enemies, and Western civilization, and all that's been handed to us, science and all these things. We have to defend that treasure. Civilization is somewhat fragile. So that's where I don't really like this media approach to just, we're not going to show what happened on 9/11 anymore. They won't show the scenes. I don't think that's the point. Somehow they're doing it wrong.
Thank you. Hi. So I got a question. In your article, you were talking about how when people sort of like see the reality of killing or some sort of violation of their moral system, you said that, or it says that you undergo sort of a progressive shrinking of your sphere of concern for others until it encompasses no one. It doesn't even include you. And then that's kind of like the actual trauma of war. And then you have, I think, if I read this correctly.
Yeah, you had talked about the person going berserk.
Yeah, and that was kind of an example back to, even in the title, where you're talking about Achilles, and then you were, I think, about how actually healing from war, kind of healing from this loss of the circle of who you seem to have concern for and show love towards. I think, if I understood correctly, could you actually expound on that and explain it a little better? Because I'm very curious.
That's really, that was Jonathan Shea's great insight, was that Jonathan Shea's story was that he was doing research on the brain chemistry of stroke victims, and then at age like 38, 35, he had a stroke. And he kind of lost his job because he was incapacitated for a couple of years. And to heal his mind, he would only read Shakespeare and the Greek classics. That was his decision. Anyway, he comes out of his convalescence, Boston University hired him. They gave him a new lab to do brain research. You know, well, the chemistry of stroke victims, but the stipulation was that he had to take care of a group of Vietnam vets who had heavily post-traumatic stress symptomology or whatever, and he noticed that the descent into the berserk state was what Achilles had experienced, and for some reason Iliad scholars hadn't made that connection. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have seen it, but so Jonathan Shea, he's still alive. He is a MacArthur Genius Grant. He's right here in Boston. So he revolutionized Iliad studies with this account. That's what's happening in the case of the berserker. This is not everyone. This is the case. This is what combat can do to us. Put us somewhere on that continuum, that bouncing down. So it's a progressive cutting of communion. What else should I say about it except that you know, the berserker is kind of rare, the full-blown berserker, but and especially because the person who crosses that line. Did I lose you guys?
No, you're here.
Okay, may well die in combat, but there's a book, and it costs $1 million on Amazon, so I haven't read it, but it's called the Berserk Style in American Culture, and it talks about how, like, our movie heroes after Vietnam they're more and more marked by their ability to just berserk, right? I saw that movie with Denzel Washington last summer, or he's in Boston and he just kills just a bunch of people, right? I mean, it was interesting for me because that account of heroism is it's Norse or something. It's completely berserk. It isn't American of, you know, 100 years ago. Or when you see what's that guy who made the movie The Patriot? You know, he also, like, really prides himself in that movie on his ability to berserk. We've come to think that that's what heroism is in America. Not in the Army. In the Army, they wouldn't tolerate that nonsense. But in film and in our private lives, we think of that a lot of times. So we've become more berserk as a culture, and that's a terrible danger to us. It's a terrible danger to us in our foreign policy, I think, too, because you can't do that.
Yeah. I'm all right.
Hello, I just have a question, kind of for me, but also people in my same situation. I have a brother who is on deployment in the Middle East, has been for 8 months, and he gets back next month, hopefully. But my question is, it relates to the quote you said earlier about part man, part soldier. Part of me is incredibly proud of who he is and what he does. Part of me is, in a sense, somewhat embarrassed, or somewhat, you know, you sense that there's a little bit miscue for the fact of just, you know what I mean, just we all sense that it's not quite right murdering people. So in my sense, my question is related to what do we do accepting those people back? It's not just for him, but generalizing to people in his situation coming back from deployment. What should the family, friends, those people do to balance those perhaps two altering, you know, devil and angel in our brain on how to handle that? So if you have any insight on my question.
You know, there's this kind of hierarchy in life, and you know, but the thing about hierarchy in Christianity is that they're always getting inverted, right? I mean, even something like post-traumatic stress, a person can be ashamed of that, but they may be liable to be ashamed of the persistence of those reactions, their uncontrollability. But another way to look at it is that that's something tremendous to be, for us to look on that person with a certain pride, because not only did they risk their lives for us, but they continue to suffer for us. So I think in a fallen world, you're always going to have police, you're always going to have soldiers. That's not going away. We can't all be the eye, we can't all be the nose. Some people are the fists, and and so, yeah, you may say, okay, that's a kind of a lower thing because whatever. But just because it is the lower means that in some ways it's the highest, because the person has risked their body and soul for us. And I think in Orthodoxy we should always have that sense about all hierarchies, the way they invert. And yeah, I mean, okay, someone else is a bishop and someone else is the guy who cleans the church, but in some ways that guy who cleans the church, he's in church all the time and he's just thinking about God, right? In some ways he's closer. So we have to recognize hierarchies and see in both ways how they're true. And I think you just want to love your brother and identify him and thank him with your whole heart and tell him how glad you are that he's back. I mean, I certainly would think, if someone broke into my house, was attacking people I loved, I would be very grateful to someone who defended me, and I wouldn't at all think, I would understand the cost of what they did to them, and that in some ways it does put them down relative to those who haven't killed, but for that very reason it also raises them up, and I don't know. I guess you could take that too far, but I think it is true. I mean, we don't regard every soldier who dies in combat as a martyr. The church was asked that question and said no, but we certainly welcome self-sacrificial love.
Dr. Tim, you talk about in the article that war, and you just mentioned a few minutes ago that war is a type of liturgy, and it got me thinking that in the same way, or that liturgy is also a type of war. I'm reminded of the passage in Matthew where Jesus is referencing John the Baptist. He says, from the time of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven is led by force or led by violence, and the violent take it by force. And what comes to mind when he says that is kind of what takes place in the liturgy, this storming of heaven that we do together in communion, in participation with Jesus Christ. And in that war that takes place, it's actually a war against what you mentioned in here before, the sensual passions, our own self-absorbed, egotistical appetites for things in the world. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and this inoculation that has against what is experienced in that other battle that is liturgy as well. That in a way it can be a counterfeit of what we experience in the liturgy.
It's we have to have so much respect for our soldiers, I think. Thank you, Father Allen, for saying that, because, I mean, a couple years ago, my mother died, right? That was a tremendous rupture in my life. A few years before that, I was in a car accident where my car was just ripped to pieces. I was unscathed. I mean, both of those experiences were so destabilizing. I mean, it's like my calm sense of order was, just turned upside down, and it took a long time to recover. Another time, I woke up. I thought my dad was looking for something in the house, and it was a burglar, and I chased that guy out, but that wasn't the smartest thing. But anyway, but that I didn't sleep well in that house for a couple of years. Now imagine in war all those things at once. You see your Jeep or something blown to smithereens. You've seen your friends die, or you see someone trying to kill you or hurt you. Those things are really an assault on a stable order. A person can unravel, and and it's amazing that more guys don't. And of course, liturgy works the other way. It really just knits us together inside. Liturgy is really the great analog to digital converter of the world, but especially of the ancient world. I mean, it converts unsteady states into clear outcomes, you know, and it produces a firmer character and saintly people over time. And we have to really we have to have the faith in liturgy. I mean, it's worth saying. I mean, what I was trying to say, that war is a kind of anti-liturgy because it mimics it, but it cuts communion. Although again, to notice the ways that, you know, within a unit it will increase communion. But as far as liturgy itself, we should always remind people that in heaven there's nothing but liturgy going on. That's the vision and the apocalypse and the revelation. That's what it is it's a liturgical universe up there, or down here, wherever we locate heaven in our hearts. It's liturgy, and through the liturgy of the church. My point, Father Allen, sorry, to your thing was, why is that a battle? Because when you're converting chaos into order, you know, that doesn't always happen easily. There's a certain resistance, you know, which liturgy mostly softens, right, and then defeats it in that way, you know. Did you see the study last week about the antidepressant effects of frankincense or incense in general or something?
Yes.
Yeah, so, you know, the church, they know what they're doing, right? They got 2,000 years of psychosomatic experience, you know, the music, all of it. It's
That's why nobody's depressed in heaven.
because the incense is always going up.
Dr. Patitsas, if you would, you know, if you have any final comments, we're coming down on the hour here. We've got about 4 minutes left, and are there any concluding remarks that you'd like to make about this? Maybe some encouragement for some of our people that do have family members that are soldiers, and maybe some of the members of our group that are possibly listening in from overseas as well. Do you have any concluding remarks?
I think, you know, just that our soldiers have out of love come forward to try to shield us. And the question is, do our diplomats and our policymakers have perfect wisdom? No, they don't. And the soldier cannot make a decision and say, only when it's the perfect incident will I, you know, honor my oath. To an extent, you know, he or she makes himself a weapon. He makes himself an instrument, and he or she is consenting for us to risk life and limb, and to also undergo all the emotional impact. And I think, you know, that nothing can change that, right? A person might kill in combat tonight in one of these wars, and therefore they can't become ordained, and in a sense a priest is a higher thing, whatever. But in another way, right, they're doing what they're doing for us, and we honor that. But at the same time, we would really like to promote, you know, wisdom in our leaders and in ourselves and our culture, that we have fewer and fewer wars, and pick and choose wisely and do what we can. And I think the prayer is really important, that it really does communicate to peace in the world. I mean, it does extend right into it. You know, and when the soldiers come back, if we're prayerful, then we can more readily embrace them and fold them back into their life of prayer and communion with the whole world. And for some that happens very easily, and for others it's difficult. It just depends. I don't know if those are good concluding remarks, Father, but it certainly is a complex issue, right? And not, it isn't as though only soldiers experience trauma. You know, we all experience it in ways large and small, and it's just a question of, as a society, I think we do need more wisdom about how to heal the soul. Right now, what I try to say in that article is we're too Greek, we're too Socratic, you go to therapy and the therapist is Socrates, and they just got it's a lot of questioning and reflection, and the way of the heart and the healing of the heart includes that, but it's also something additional, which we have to recover. I don't know where we're going to look to recover that, but we have to recover that, and that's what Jonathan Shea says in Achilles in Vietnam. Incidentally, I should say one other thing. So I've had a lot of good feedback from soldiers. I've had a little bit more negative feedback from therapists, and they basically have two negative reactions, one of which I like and one of which I don't really like. The one I like is they say that the science of treating trauma is advancing these last 15, 20 years and moving in less cognitive directions, less just talk therapy directions. So it's become more about the body and the heart, and it's become more holistic. And so there's a lot of hope there, which I didn't really know about that when I wrote that article, gave that interview. But other therapists just don't like the interview because they don't realize how completely Greek they are. And the thing about Orthodoxy is that it's the least Greek of the Christian faiths, because all the others have not managed to really hold on to the core of the Semitic insight and about the way of the heart. And of course, because we call ourselves Greek Orthodox, we completely miss the point. But really, we're the least classically Greek, and if we lose that, we just become too intellectualizing about everything. Then we could just hang it up. We need to find another job, find another faith, because that way of the heart is so vital. Father Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tim.
Thank you, people. Good luck, and God bless anyone listening out there in the world too.
We're so very grateful for your taking the time. So late at night there. It's 11 o'clock at night there, and
well, now it's midnight. It's midnight. So
we started at 11 o'clock. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I couldn't leave the house today. We had 3 feet of snow, so I wasn't going anywhere. So this was a good way to get out.
All right. Well, we pray that you get some warm weather there soon to kind of melt some of that away, and that. But we also hope that you've had a chance to get some rest through this. Because
believe me, listen, keep us in your prayers here at the school, and of course for the weather too, but just keep us in your prayers, and I keep all of you in my prayers, and I wish you a good evening.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Tim.
Thanks,
good night.
Noah. Your blessing, Father.
God bless you.